If you've been with us the past several months, you'll know that I'm working through the book of 2 Corinthians. And so we're up to chapter 9. But for those who haven't been here for the past several months that I've been taking to go through this book, I thought I probably should give a very brief overview on what the book has been about thus far. If we recall, chapters 1 through 7 are dealing with the end result of a lot of baggage and water under the bridge that Paul has had with the Corinthians. He's had a previous letter to them that was very difficult for him to write. There were many problems with that church that he was trying to resolve with them. He had visits with them which had not gone well, and their relationship was very fragile, very fraught. And this letter, 2 Corinthians, is Paul. He's finally had a bit of good news from the Corinthians through his brother Titus. Titus has come back to Paul and said the Corinthians are improving, they're listening. And so this letter is his reconciliation with the Corinthians, especially the first 7 chapters which we've covered over the past few months. He's reconciling with them, trying to sort of patch things up and mend their relationship. And through that, there's a lot of talk about his doctrine in there, there's relationships, there's even his travel itinerary. He talks about that briefly. All these sorts of things are lumped into this letter, and it's a bit jumbled around. Now, last month we started on the second section of this letter. If we recall, this letter is broadly divided into 3 sections, right? Very broadly speaking, but 1 to 7 is sort of around reconciliation. Chapters 8 and 9, he hones in a specific subject, which is of a collection that they were running, a financial collection. And the last few chapters of this letter, he's dealing with the problem of the false teachers. There are still false teachers in that congregation. He still has to deal with those. That's what the last part of his letter is about. So last month, we got halfway through that middle section, which is on the collection, chapters 8 and 9 of this letter. So we'll be looking mostly at chapter 9 today, 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And we'll hopefully get through to the end of that. Now, before we look at that, let's see when this matter first came up. Talking about collection, it actually comes up first in 1 Corinthians, and we did look at this last month. But let's turn to 1 Corinthians 16, which Alan has actually thankfully just alluded to in the Lord's Supper, in the talk he gave about the collection. Because Paul, of course, he's talking to the Corinthians here in 1 Corinthians 16, and we noticed last month when I went through chapter 8, we looked at this as well, but we're going to look at it again as part of a brief revision. We saw in verse 1 it says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper." So there we have that commandment, which Alan has already gone through, right? That is a commandment, just as Paul gives it to the Corinthians and the Galatians and every other congregation, so it applies to us also as a general commandment. But we also have noticed that when we put this together with what's in 2 Corinthians, that there was actually something else going on here, and that is a special collection that the Corinthians were raising for needy saints in Jerusalem. It wasn't part of their regular weekly collection. They had offered, and we'll see that later, they had offered to do something a bit extra because there was a special need at that time for the saints in Jerusalem. And so what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 3, he says, "When I arrive," he's planning on coming to the Corinthians, "whoever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem." So, recall, if you remember last month, we were saying, well, why was there this special need in Jerusalem for this gift? We can't be sure, right? But we know from a few passages in Acts 11 verse 27, the prophet Agabus had stood up and said there was going to be a great famine. We know in Acts 8 verses 1, starting in verse 1, a great persecution arose in all of Judea, and all the disciples were scattered about the region. So there was persecution taking place in Jerusalem, and there was famine on top of that. I don't know if they were at the same time or not. We don't know exactly the timing here, but let's say perhaps they were. And then, of course, Jesus himself prophesied in Matthew 24 that prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred by the Romans in AD 70, there would be many persecutions taking place. So there was this special need in Jerusalem, and we can sort of try and figure out what the cause of that is. And so Paul is saying in here in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 3, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And we recall the reason why Paul had said it that way, right? Why is it that they, whom they approve? The reason is, as we'll see, their relationship was not going well, and Paul is hands off saying, I'm not going to take this money because I don't want to get accused. I don't want to open up any door for anybody to accuse me of anything, because he'd been accused many times by the Corinthians. Whoever you choose, they can go. I'm not going to have anything to do with this. I'm just a facilitator. And we'll see that when we turn back to 2 Corinthians, we'll see the same sort of we'll make the same observation, that there was this personal problem between the Corinthians and Paul. So turning now to 2 Corinthians, and specifically chapter 8. He starts in verse 1 talking about, he slowly introduces the subject of the collection, but the core of the matter is actually in verse 10. Verse 10 says, I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage. Here we go. For who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it, but now finish doing it also, so that just as there was the readiness to desire it, so there may also be the completion of it by your ability. And here he is talking about this special collection that they had desired to do. There was they who came up with this idea to do this collection to the Corinthians. And in fact, it was a year ago. A year ago they had come up with this idea, and they still hadn't finished it. And that's why Paul's writing them now. They've had all these problems to deal with. It's fallen off their radar, on the back burner. They haven't dealt with it. They've said they were going to do this thing. It was optional, but they said they were going to do it. And Paul's saying, well, what are you doing here? And I think I closed last month's sermon by sort of trying to get an idea of the culture that existed in the Corinthian congregation at the time. You know, we can, by reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we can sort of get an idea of the type of people that lived in that city. It was a wealthy city. It was an important part of the Roman Empire. The people there would have been wealthy. We don't read of any persecution taking place in Corinth. We read about it taking place in Jerusalem, in Macedonia, and other parts of the world, but we don't have any evidence that, and we're not saying it didn't happen, but we don't have any evidence of persecution really taking place in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about their issues with idolatry. They were very blasé towards idolatry, saying, oh, what does it really matter? Who cares? It's not real. Paul saying, no, it does matter. And they seem to have this sort of liberal attitude, but very, very quick to fall away in times of persecution, not persecution, but trouble. They didn't have trouble like any other congregations had. Their troubles were almost self-caused. They were infighting amongst each other. They were allowing a man who had his father's wife, incest or whatever it was, to just happily live in the congregation and boast about it and look and say how liberal they were, that they were okay with this. They were the classic sort of, we can see it today in modern society, there's modern liberal ideas of thinking everything's all good because we're so wise, we're so knowledgeable about things. And that's what I see in the Corinthian church. And so they had this great idea to do this extra collection for the saints in Jerusalem. Very noble-minded, but faced with a little bit of difficulty, they forgot about it. So importantly, going back to 2 Corinthians, what verse are we up to? verse 10. Paul is saying now, yes, he's following him up, but he's saying, I'm giving my opinion on this matter. For this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago. So it's an opinion. It's not a command. What we read before in 1 Corinthians 16 about the collection on the first day of the week, that's the command that Paul gives to the Corinthians and the Galatians and every other congregation. But this one here is this additional thing that they had decided to do, and Paul's giving his opinion. And it's not a bad opinion. You said you were going to do it. It's important, but you haven't finished it yet. So Paul's saying, well, you should finish it. You should do these things because you said you were going to do it. And remember, of course, the irony being that they were the ones who had accused Paul of being of vacillating on his travel itinerary, how he'd said he'd go to Macedonia. This is in chapter 1, for those who weren't here. He'd said he'd go to Corinth, then Macedonia. He changed his itinerary slightly, and they complained about it and said, oh, look how untrustworthy he is, because he didn't do what he said he was going to do. And here the irony is a far more important thing than a travel itinerary. They'd said they were going to give money to needy saints in Jerusalem, and a year later they still haven't done it. And who's the one who's not letting your yes be yes and your no be no? It's, if anybody, it's the Corinthians, not Paul. Anyway, so in chapter 9 now, having gone through that, the key here is that Paul is not issuing a command to these Corinthians. It was an optional, additional collection that they had decided to run of their own accord. And so Paul isn't going to go down the command road and say, you must do this. But he is going to use the means of things like integrity or honour or even embarrassment to say, well, you said you were going to do it. You should finish it. Not that you have to, but you should. So if we read in, starting now in chapter 9, verse 1, he starts off by saying, for it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. So he's talking about the collection. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia, and Achaia is that region of, it's the southern parts of Greece basically, that Achaia, and Corinth was part of that, that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. For I have sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift, so that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. So, as I said, the issue here is one of reputation and honour, in fact. Paul's not issuing a commandment, but if we look through this, we can see verse 2 says, I have boasted to you about the Macedonians. So Paul's north in Macedonia, he's north of Corinth, he's telling them how great these Corinthians are. They've made this wonderful promise to give this collection, this special collection to Jerusalem. Paul's reputation is at stake here. If that doesn't happen, he'll be embarrassed. Secondly, Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. So Corinth being at the sort of epicenter of Achaia, all the congregations in the rest of Greece, whether it's in Athens or Sparta or wherever else, they would have all heard about this wonderful thing the Corinthians were doing. They're all watching. Maybe they're running their own special collections as well, using that the Corinthian promise as their motivation to do that. They're all looking at Corinth as well. In verse 4 it says, so Paul is planning, of course, after this letter, he's going to follow the letter, he's going to send it off, and then he's going to come weeks or months later, how long that may be, he's going to come down from Macedonia and visit the Corinthians to pick up that collection or assist in facilitating it. He might bring some Macedonians with him. And he says in verse 4, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. So embarrassment all around is on the cards if this promise falls through. And that's what Paul's getting at here. There is, although it's not a commandment, it's not a matter of sin or righteousness, there is a matter of embarrassment here and integrity. Now the last part, what we read before about in verse 5, this bountiful gift, and at the very end, not being affected by covetousness. So of course, Paul's sending this letter to them in advance of his own coming to get them ready. Because for all he knows, with all the stuff that's been going on that we talked about previously, all the water under the bridge, they've just totally forgotten about the whole thing. I don't know. It's possible that he's worried they've just totally forgotten the promise they had made a year ago to run this special collection. And then so he's reminding them, make sure it's ready when I come. The second part is, I think, let's put ourselves in the position of these Corinthians. Let's imagine ourselves in that city of Corinth, doing our day-to-day business, and then suddenly Paul rocks up at the gates. Hey everybody, where's that money you promised? I mean, and they're, oh, we don't have anything. We didn't do anything. We've got nothing ready. And suddenly they're going to be, we did say that. We better put some money in quickly. Let's get everything we can and put it together. And I can imagine that there would be people putting in things that they hadn't planned for, they weren't ready for, maybe financially they weren't capable of doing. They're going to be doing things they're not happy about. They're not ready for it. So Paul is telling them this, that he's coming, that make sure it's ready, so they've got time to think it through. They're going to have weeks or months, however long it takes for Paul to get down there, to actually plan and get the funds ready, get it together, that there's no covetousness involved. There's no reluctance in anything that they're doing, because they're ready for it. He doesn't want this to be something that is under obligation. Now, the message for us here today, I think, is, and perhaps some of us have it in our heads already, is what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, but not for all things are lawful, but not all things edify. Now, what does that mean? Let's turn there. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23. Paul's talking about things that are maybe allowed, strictly speaking. They're not sinful to do, but doesn't mean they're a good thing to do. And Paul here is talking in the context of eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he's saying, well, yeah, you can eat meat sacrificed to idols, and that's a study in itself, right? This is another study about another problem the Corinthians had. But he's saying, well, yeah, it's not a sin, but if it's going to create other problems, then you shouldn't do it. It doesn't edify. If it creates problems and it's not strictly a sin, you still shouldn't do it. So I said, not all things edify. That was in verse 23. All things are lawful, 1 Corinthians 10:23. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. And I think the point I would make here is that the Corinthians' extra promised gift was not mandated. They didn't have to do that. But they had said they were going to do it. So Paul's not going to bind them to that. But it's about edification and it's about profit. They had said they were going to do this thing. They weren't bound to it. But to not do it now is something that is not edifying and it is not profitable. There is a link there between it's like inverse. In this case, they weren't bound to do it, but it is something that's edifying, and they should do it for that reason. And of course, we know from what Jesus said in Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? That applies to anything that we do. We shouldn't be hypocrites. We shouldn't be changing our minds one way or another. We shouldn't be flaky, as the term goes. If we say we're going to do something, we should go follow through and do it. And that's exactly what Jesus had said to his disciples way back then. Paul was saying basically the same thing now. You said you were going to do it. You weren't obliged to do it, but you chose to do it. And now everyone's looking at you saying, are you going to do it or not? Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Now, going back to 2 Corinthians. This sort of, like I said, chapters 8 and 9 is one section. And it's Paul sort of, he switches from, I guess, exalting them. He talks about logistics at the end of chapter 8, which we looked at last month. Who's actually going to do the collection? In this case, he sent Titus ahead of him and a few other brethren to help him out. But the second part of chapter 9 at least, after having finished in verse 5 talking about sort of still logistical matters really, it continues on from chapter 8. He's still talking logistics about he's going to come with the Macedonians, is everyone going to be embarrassed or not, things like that. In verses 6 down to basically the end of this chapter, he's talking more about, he moves on to a different subject which is doctrinal. Really, it's not about logistics anymore. And he's reminding them that through it all, everything that we're talking about, it's about God in the end. It's not about them or him or even the saints in Jerusalem. He's telling them that all these things anyway come from God, and that we should be full of thanksgiving to God for these things anyway. So let's read on from chapter 9, verse 6. He says this, "Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do just as he purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." So there we have that reminder that Paul doesn't want this to be affected by covetousness. That's why he's giving them the warning. "And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever." That's a quote from the Old Testament there. "Now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God." Now, like I said, Paul's making this about God now. If any of those Corinthians were affected by covetousness, were worried about their own physical well-being resulting from this collection, which was optional anyway, if they were worried about that, Paul is reminding them that in the end, all these things come from God anyway. And there's that promise there in verse 6. "Now I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." Now this is no promise from God that if we give lots of money to the collection that God will make sure we get it all back plus 10 times more. There's no financial promise here. But in the end, and I've said this many times over the past few months, that if you could pick one theme for this letter, it was the distinction between the physical and the spiritual. That the Corinthians were seeing everything through a physical lens, and Paul was trying to change that and see it through a spiritual lens. And although they might be giving a physical gift, it's a spiritual act that they're doing. And when he talks about them sowing sparingly or bountifully, you might be giving a little bit of money or a lot of money, or I'll get to what you're capable of giving in a moment. But in the end, it's a spiritual act. And what you sow spiritually, that is the promise from God. Not the physical wealth, it's the wealth of serving the gospel. That's what comes back, the righteousness that comes from it. That is the promise from God, that if we sow bountifully, spiritually in the gospel, we will reap bountifully in the gospel also. But it's got nothing to do with prosperity gospel, getting rich through the gospel. And he goes on to say, each one must do as he purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Verse 8, and God is able to make all grace abound to you. So that's the promise there about the bountiful gift, isn't it? That it's not about the physical wealth under the gospel. It's about the grace of God that comes to us. When we partake in that gospel and have fellowship with God, that's when God gives us of his grace. And then he says, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have abundance for every good deed. So we might say, well, someone might say, I have no money, what can I possibly give? And I'm sure most of us have in our minds the story of the widow with the mite or the penny. Let's turn there in Mark 12. Mark 12, verse 41. Totally the wrong chapter. So we have people here giving, this is under the old law, giving to the temple treasury in Mark 12:41, and he says, and he, that Jesus, he sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury and how many rich people were putting in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amount to a cent. That's in the New American Standard. And calling his disciples to him, he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the contributors to the treasury, for they all put in out of their surplus, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she owned, all she has to live on. So if anybody is thinking from what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians that this abundance that he's referring to, about being bountiful and things like that, it's not about the person giving the money. It's not about the physical money. Paul's making that very clear that in the end, like I said, this is a spiritual act that we partake in. And the amount of money, as what Jesus says, isn't what matters here. It's about what we want to do for Christ and what we want to do for the furtherance of the gospel. And it doesn't matter, because in the end, God is the one who makes it grow anyway. In the end, whether you put in $2 or $100 or $1 million, God is the one who directs it, and he causes the growth. Now it says in verse, one second. Verse 10, it says, 2 Corinthians 9 verse 10, it says, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. So Paul is still using that example, that metaphor of sowing seed and bread. Now, he is talking literally here though, isn't he? In the first part of this verse, he's talking, yeah, God does give us what we need. In James 1:17, it talks about all good things are a gift from the Father of lights in heaven. That includes the seeds. That includes the bread that we have. They're all gifts from God. Any good thing that we have in our lives is a gift from God. But it says, he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food. If he can give you these things, how much more can he give you things that you can use to serve the gospel? It says, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing. And that's talking about that act there, our ability to serve the gospel. If he can give us seed for sowing and bread for food, then he will give us seed for sowing in the gospel and increase the harvest of your righteousness. So in the end, the Corinthians, Paul is reminding them, in the end, whether it's physical food or seed or your ability to participate in the gospel, it all comes from God anyway. So don't worry about it. That's the point he's trying to make. And that seed that we can sow in the gospel, I'm not just talking about, and Paul's not just talking about that collection that we run on the first day of the week, is he? There's all different types of many ways that we can serve the gospel, whether it is through, the collection is one way. We can show hospitality towards each other. We can help the sick, visit the orphan and the widow. We teach, we preach, we make a defence of the gospel to those who ask it. There are so many ways that we can serve the gospel that aren't financial related. And when Paul says that in verse 10, you multiply your seed for sowing, there is a multiplicity of ways that we can use to serve the gospel. And then finally, in the last part of this chapter, moving on from that reminder that everything comes from God, he moves into the subject of thanksgiving, which is still the same broad subject. That he's saying this is something to be thankful for, not to be miserly about or reluctant about. We should be giving thanks to God. And it says in verse 11, you will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God, and that's probably talking about the saints in Jerusalem, the they there. They will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all. While they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. So this section now, in chapter 10, he moves into the super apostles, as he calls them ironically or sarcastically. That takes a big turn in chapter 10. But here at least he's closing up with this thanksgiving to God, that there is this liberality that we have in God, that we can all participate in the righteousness of God and sharing, at least in this context, financial means to help those who are seriously struggling and going through persecution. I think one thing I would say about this passage, which is focused on the thanksgiving, is we all live in a 21st century society where the welfare state exists. If you fall upon hard times, you can go to the government and they'll just give you money, basically. That's not how it was 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. They didn't have a welfare state like what we have today. Basically, it was non-existent. And furthermore, if you weren't a Roman citizen, you had even less rights. The people living in Jerusalem, they were by and large not Roman citizens. Paul being, of course, an exception to that, although he wasn't even from there. But if you weren't a Roman citizen, you lacked a lot of rights. And even if you were a Roman citizen, there certainly wasn't really any welfare to go around. And I think many people today, secular people, look back on the Roman Empire as this glorious civilization, this epitome of civilization. They don't realise it was a very cruel place. It was a cruel place and a difficult place. If you fell in hard times, then you couldn't go to the government for a handout. That was it. You become a beggar, or something like that. You might turn to your family for support, perhaps, you might say. What does Jesus say about that? Turn to Luke 12. Luke 12 verse 52 says, if you want to serve me, if you want to be a Christian and serve Christ, in verse 52, from now on, 5 members in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Those Christians living in Jerusalem may not have even had family members to rely upon. And yet, Jesus also said something else. He doesn't just give the sad, the despairing, does he? He gives us hope also. If we turn to Matthew chapter 12, Matthew 12. Verse 48 says, And this is when his physical mother, Mary, and his brothers and sisters have come to him. And Paul says, yes, who are my real brothers and sisters and mother? In verse 48, Jesus answered the one who was telling him that and said, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, "Behold my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother." So think about now what a blessing it would have been for those brethren in Jerusalem who were going through trials and tribulations. Maybe they didn't have physical brothers and sisters and parents to rely upon. Maybe they had no one to turn to. But God has made this way by which your spiritual brethren can support you and help you. And that's where we see the overflowing of thanksgiving from Paul here. What an amazing thing it would have been. Unheard of in those days. For someone who you potentially never met, you're not physically related to, they're in a different part of the world, Greece and Palestine, and they're giving you money, all because you serve Christ. Nothing like that existed at the time. Just totally unheard of. You didn't help each other in that way under any sort of pagan religion. There was no secular allowance for it. So, in concluding these two chapters, chapters 8 and 9, like I said before, Paul is trying to instill this mindset change on the Corinthians between the physical and the spiritual. For chapters 1 to 7, people were saying about Paul how he had been persecuted and thrown out from cities, and then he throws out to the next city and he's a vagabond. And they were looking at that and saying, who is this Paul? There's something wrong with him. He's clearly not to be trusted. And Paul's saying, no, I'm suffering for the sake of Christ. These are persecutions. Because they were looking at things with physical eyes, they didn't realise that. And even though it's a different subject matter, we're talking about the collection, it's actually the same theme going on here. That the Corinthians, they'd made a great promise to help these saints in Jerusalem. But if they were worried about where that money was going to come from, or they were worried about how it was going to be spent, Paul was reminding them, spiritually, you're actually still in the service of Christ. You're just doing it in a different way. So he's trying to instill that mindset change, and I can only imagine how challenging it would have been for Paul to try and get it through to these Corinthians, that they have to change the way they think and the way they view physical and spiritual matters. So in conclusion then, I think the two things that we can get from these two chapters is, firstly, we be careful that poorly thought out words and actions don't bring the church into disrepute or embarrassment. They weren't obliged to do this special collection, but they had said they were going to do it. Paul is saying, well, for the sake of embarrassment, you should finish what you started. In 1 Peter 2 verse 12 it says, and this is addressed to Christians, keep your behaviour excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Keep your behaviour excellent among the Gentiles, is what Peter says. It's not just about obeying the scriptures just to the letter, just doing the bare minimum. We must keep our behaviour excellent. And if we say we're going to do something, let our yes be yes and our no be no. And I think finally we should also recognise that, as we read here, we're all part of that same body of Christ. That we have brethren throughout the world, and in the past and in the future, if God gives us that, who are all part of that same body of Christ. And we have that amazing blessing that we can give thanks to God for, that we are all sharing in that people who we've never met, we all have that same goal and purpose in mind. Thank you for your time.